She tried to resign after a night with her boss, but the millionaire was already in love with her. Before we explore all the details of this incredible story, tell us where you're following us from and the time. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a thing, and let's embark on this journey together. She knew she shouldn't be staring at him like this, but she couldn't help herself. Sophie Miller adjusted her tortoiseshell glasses and smoothed down her perfectly pressed navy blazer. Her dark brown eyes focused intently on the computer screen. At 26, she had mastered the art of invisible efficiency, the kind that kept the corporate machine running without anyone noticing the hands that moved its gears. Her natural hair was pulled back into a neat, professional bun that highlighted the elegant curve of her neck, and her warm mahogany skin seemed to glow even under the harsh fluorescent lights of the 42nd floor. The corner office of Walker Industries commanded a breathtaking view of Manhattan's skyline, but Sophie rarely had time to appreciate it. She was too busy managing the controlled chaos that was Daniel Walker's schedule, his meetings, his life. Sophie. The voice cut through her concentration like a blade through silk. Daniel Walker stood in the doorway of his office, 6'2" of perfectly tailored authority. His charcoal grey Tom Ford suit fit his athletic frame like it was sculpted for him, and his steel blue eyes held that familiar intensity that made grown men stutter during board meetings. His dark brown hair was styled with just enough casual dishevelment to soften his otherwise sharp features, but nothing could soften the commanding presence he carried wherever he went. "Yes, Mr. Walker." Sophie's voice was steady, professional. 3 years as his personal assistant had taught her to keep her tone neutral, even when her pulse quickened at the way he said her name. "The Los Angeles trip. I need you to come with me." Sophie's fingers paused over her keyboard. Business trips with Daniel were nothing new, but something in his tone made her look up. He was studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read, not his usual calculating business stare, but something softer. "Of course. How long will we be there?" 3 days. "The Meridian deal requires my personal attention, and you know those contracts better than anyone." He moved closer to her desk, close enough that she caught a hint of his cologne, something expensive and undeniably masculine. "Pack for warm weather." "And Sophie?" "Yes?" "Book us rooms at the Beverly Hills Hotel. Separate wings." The last part was added almost as an afterthought, but Sophie caught the slight tension in his jaw as he said it. She nodded, already pulling up the hotel's website, trying to ignore the way her heart had skipped when he mentioned separate wings. As if she would have assumed otherwise, as if she would have wanted otherwise. Don't go there, she warned herself silently. Daniel Walker was her boss, brilliant, demanding, impossibly wealthy, and completely off limits. He dated socialites and heiresses whose pictures graced the society pages of the New York Times. Women with trust funds and private jets, women who spoke 3 languages and attended charity galas in designer gowns that cost more than Sophie's yearly rent. Sophie Miller was the daughter of a Detroit public school teacher and a postal worker who had scraped together every penny to send her to Columbia. She was competent, educated, and proud of how far she'd come, but she was also realistic about the worlds that separated her from the man who signed her paychecks. "Will there be anything else?" she asked, her fingers already flying over the keyboard as she made his travel arrangements. Daniel hesitated at the threshold of his office. For a moment, Sophie thought he might say something more, but instead, he simply shook his head and disappeared behind the heavy oak doors. The afternoon passed in its usual blur of phone calls, emails, and crisis management. Sophie rescheduled 2 board meetings, negotiated with a difficult client in Tokyo, and somehow found time to order Daniel's dry cleaning and arrange for his housekeeper to water his ridiculously expensive orchids while he was away. At 6:30, the office had emptied except for the cleaning crew and the soft glow of Sophie's desk lamp. She was double-checking the flight details when Daniel emerged from his office, his tie loosened and his suit jacket draped over his arm. "You're still here, just finishing up the Los Angeles arrangements." She saved her work and began shutting down her computer. "Your flight is at 9 a.m. tomorrow. I'll meet you at JFK. Sophie." Something in his tone made her look up. He was standing beside her desk now, close enough that she could see the faint lines around his eyes that spoke of long nights and endless responsibilities. "Thank you for everything you do. I know I don't say it enough." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. In 3 years, Daniel Walker had never been anything but strictly professional with her. Polite, demanding, occasionally frustrated, but never personal. "It's my job, Mr. Walker." "Daniel," he said softly. "When it's just us, you can call me Daniel. Sophie felt something shift in the air between them, something that made her pulse quicken and her breath catch. For a moment, neither of them moved, and she found herself drowning in those steel-blue eyes that seemed to see right through her carefully constructed professional facade. Then her phone buzzed with a text message, breaking the spell. "I should go," she said quickly, grabbing her purse and coat. "Long day tomorrow." As she hurried toward the elevator, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, something that made her both excited and terrified for their trip to Los Angeles. The elevator doors closed, and she caught her reflection in the polished steel. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright with something she didn't dare name. 3 days in Los Angeles, she thought. What could possibly happen in 3 days? But deep down in the part of her heart she kept carefully locked away, Sophie Miller already knew the answer to that question. The moment she stepped off that plane, Sophie knew Los Angeles would change everything. The California sun hit Sophie's face like a warm embrace as she emerged from LAX's terminal, her carry-on bag rolling smoothly behind her. Even at 10 in the morning, the air shimmered with heat and possibility, so different from New York's sharp autumn bite. She adjusted her lightweight cream blazer and searched the sea of faces for their driver. "Ms. Miller." A uniformed chauffeur approached with a professional smile, and within minutes, Sophie found herself sliding into the plush leather interior of a black Mercedes. Daniel was already seated, his attention focused on his phone, but he looked up as she settled beside him. "Good flight?" he asked, and Sophie noticed he'd ditched his usual tie. The top button of his white dress shirt was undone, revealing just a hint of his collarbone. It was such a small change, but somehow it made him look less like the intimidating CEO and more like a man. "Perfect, thank you." Sophie pulled out her tablet, ready to review their schedule. "The Meridian team wants to meet at 2, which gives us time to check into the hotel and—" Sophie. She looked up to find Daniel studying her with an amused expression. "It's Los Angeles. Relax a little. Relax." As if that were possible when she was sitting this close to him, when the California sun was making his steel-blue eyes look almost silver, when the familiar scent of his cologne was mixing with the ocean breeze drifting through the car's slightly open window. "I am relaxed," she said, which was such an obvious lie that Daniel actually chuckled. The sound sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. In 3 years she'd heard Daniel Walker laugh exactly 4 times, and each one had been during phone calls with clients. Never directed at her, never like this, soft and genuine, and somehow intimate. The Beverly Hills Hotel rose before them like something from a fairy tale, all pink stucco and palm trees and old Hollywood glamour. Sophie had seen it in movies, of course, but being here felt surreal. The bellhop who greeted them called Daniel Mr. Walker, with the kind of deference reserved for regular guests, and Sophie realized this wasn't his first stay here. "Ms. Miller, your suite is in the garden wing," the concierge informed her with a polished smile. "And Mr. Walker, you're in your usual penthouse." Usual penthouse. Sophie tried not to think about how many women Daniel might have brought here before, how many sophisticated socialites had shared champagne with him on whatever terrace came with a penthouse suite at the Beverly Hills Hotel. "Actually," Daniel's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts, "I'd like to change Ms. Miller's reservation, put her in the suite next to mine." Sophie's eyes widened. "Mr. Walker, that's not necessary." "Daniel," he corrected, that same soft tone from the night before. "And it is necessary. We'll be working late on the Meridian contracts. It's more efficient." Efficient, right. Because everything with Daniel Walker was about efficiency. 20 minutes later, Sophie stood in the marble-appointed bathroom of what was definitely not a standard hotel room. It was a suite that probably cost more per night than she made in a month, complete with a living area, a dining table, and French doors that opened onto a private balcony overlooking the hotel's legendary pool. She unpacked her clothes with practiced efficiency, hanging her conservative business attire in the walk-in closet. At the bottom of her suitcase, wrapped carefully in tissue paper, was the one item she'd debated bringing, a flowing emerald dress she'd bought on sale months ago, but never had occasion to wear. It was beautiful, elegant, and completely inappropriate for business meetings. Why did I even pack this, she wondered. But she hung it up anyway. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Daniel stood in the hallway and Sophie's breath caught. He'd changed out of his business attire into dark jeans and a soft grey sweater that clung to his shoulders in ways that should be illegal. He looked younger, more approachable, devastatingly handsome. "Ready for lunch?" he asked. "I know a place." The place turned out to be a small Italian cafe, tucked away on a quiet street in West Hollywood, the kind of spot that clearly wasn't frequented by tourists. The owner greeted Daniel like an old friend, leading them to a table on the sun-dappled patio, where jasmine vines climbed the brick walls and the sound of the city felt miles away. "You come here often?" Sophie asked, settling into her chair and trying not to stare at the way the dappled sunlight brought out the gold flecks in Daniel's eyes. "When I'm in town, it reminds me that not everything has to be about business." He paused, studying her face. "You look different here." "Different how?" "Softer. More—" He seemed to search for the word. "More yourself." Sophie felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm always myself, Mr. Walker." "Daniel," he said again, leaning forward slightly. "And no, you're not. In New York, you're my assistant, professional, composed, perfect." His voice dropped lower. "But right now, you look like Sophie." The way he said her name sent a shiver down her spine despite the warm afternoon air. This was dangerous territory, the kind of conversation that crossed lines she'd spent 3 years carefully maintaining. "We should probably discuss the Meridian meeting," she said, reaching for her tablet. Daniel's hand covered hers, stopping her. His touch was warm, gentle, and completely inappropriate. "The meeting isn't for 3 hours. Can't we just be 2 people having lunch?" Sophie looked down at their joined hands, at the way her dark skin contrasted with his, at how right it looked, despite how wrong it should feel. When she looked up, Daniel was watching her with an intensity that made her pulse race. "I don't know how to be just Sophie with you," she admitted quietly. "Then let me show you," he said, and his thumb traced a small circle across her knuckles that sent electricity shooting up her arm. The waiter appeared with their wine, breaking the moment, but something had shifted between them. As they talked over pasta and shared stories that had nothing to do with quarterly reports or board meetings, Sophie felt walls she'd spent years building begin to crumble. Daniel told her about growing up in Boston, about the pressure of inheriting his father's business empire, about how sometimes he felt like he was living someone else's life. Sophie found herself sharing things she'd never told anyone at work, her dreams of writing, her parents' sacrifices to send her to college, the way she sometimes felt invisible in rooms full of powerful people. "You're not invisible," Daniel said when she mentioned it. "You're the first person I see when I walk into the office every morning, the last person I think about before I leave every night." The words hung in the air between them like a confession. Sophie's heart hammered against her ribs as she processed what he'd just said. "Daniel, I know," he said quickly. "I know this is complicated. I know I'm your boss, and this is probably the last thing you want to hear." "It's not that," Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible over the cafe's ambient noise. "It's that I've been thinking the same thing, and that terrifies me." Daniel's eyes searched her face, and Sophie saw her own confusion and desire reflected back at her. The successful businessman, the man who commanded boardrooms and closed million-dollar deals, looked suddenly vulnerable. "What are we doing, Sophie?" Before she could answer, her phone buzzed with a reminder about their meeting. The spell was broken, reality crashing back in like a cold wave. "We should go," she said, pulling her hand away from his. "The Meridian team will be waiting." As they walked back to the hotel in silence, Sophie's mind raced. Something had changed during that lunch, something that couldn't be taken back or ignored. The careful professional distance she'd maintained for 3 years was crumbling, and she had no idea how to stop it. "What happens in Los Angeles?" she thought, but couldn't bring herself to finish the cliché, because deep down she was starting to hope that whatever happened in Los Angeles wouldn't stay there. When the meeting ended, Sophie realized the real negotiation was just beginning. The Meridian conference room overlooked downtown Los Angeles, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city sprawling toward the mountains. Sophie sat quietly to Daniel's left, her tablet open, fingers poised to take notes as the team of lawyers and executives filed in. But her mind kept drifting to lunch, to the way Daniel had looked at her across that small cafe table, to the warmth of his hand covering hers, to the words that had passed between them like secrets. "You're the first person I see when I walk into the office every morning." "Gentlemen," Daniel's voice cut through her thoughts as he stood to greet the Meridian team. "Thank you for accommodating our schedule." Sophie watched him transform back into the Daniel Walker she knew from New York, commanding, focused, every inch the successful CEO. But now she could see the subtle signs of the man she'd glimpsed at lunch, the way his fingers drummed once against his thigh when he was thinking, the slight softening around his eyes when he smiled. "Mr. Walker," James Meridian, a silver-haired man in his 60s, extended his hand. Always a pleasure. I trust your flight was comfortable. Very, thank you. I believe you know my assistant, Sophie Miller. She's been instrumental in reviewing the contract details. Sophie felt heat rise in her cheeks as every eye in the room turned to her. In New York, she was used to being invisible during meetings, the efficient assistant who took notes and managed logistics. But the way Daniel introduced her, with respect, with acknowledgement of her contributions, made her sit a little straighter. Ms. Miller, James Meridian nodded warmly. I've heard excellent things about your work. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of financial projections, delivery schedules, and liability clauses. Sophie found herself surprisingly engaged, offering insights when Daniel looked to her, catching discrepancies that others missed. At one point, when the Meridian team tried to adjust payment terms unfavorably, she caught Daniel's eye and gave an almost imperceptible shake of her head. He paused, reconsidered, and countered with terms that saved Walker Industries nearly $2 million. I think we have a deal, Daniel said finally, rising to shake hands around the table. As the Meridian team gathered their papers and said their goodbyes, James Meridian lingered beside Sophie's chair. Ms. Miller, if you ever decide you want a change of scenery, we could use someone with your eye for detail in Los Angeles. Sophie smiled politely. That's very kind of you to say. When the room finally emptied, leaving just Sophie and Daniel alone, she began packing up her notes. That was well done, Daniel said quietly. Just doing my job. No. He moved closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne again. That was exceptional. You saved us millions on that payment schedule adjustment. Sophie looked up to find him studying her with an expression she'd never seen before, something between admiration and something deeper, more dangerous. I told you I know those contracts better than anyone, she said, trying to keep her voice light. You do. You know them. You know my business. You know. He paused, his voice dropping lower. You know me better than I thought anyone could. The conference room suddenly felt too small, too intimate. The late afternoon sun streaming through the windows cast golden highlights across Daniel's face, and Sophie found herself noticing details she'd never allowed herself to see before. The way his jaw tensed when he was thinking, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the way he was looking at her like she was the only person in the world. Daniel, she said softly, but she didn't know how to finish the sentence. Have dinner with me tonight. The words hung in the air between them. Not a command, not a business obligation, an invitation. I don't think that's... Not as my assistant, he said quickly. As Sophie, the woman who just impressed a room full of sharks, who makes me laugh, who sees through my walls like they don't even exist. Sophie's heart hammered against her ribs. This was the moment, the line they'd been dancing around for hours, maybe for years. Once crossed, there would be no going back to the careful professional distance that had defined their relationship. One dinner, Daniel said softly. If you want to pretend this never happened afterward, we can. But Sophie, I need to know if what I felt at lunch was real. She looked into his steel blue eyes and saw something that made her breath catch. Vulnerability. Daniel Walker, the man who commanded boardrooms and closed impossible deals, was asking her to dinner like a nervous teenager. One dinner, she heard herself say. The smile that spread across Daniel's face was unlike anything she'd ever seen from him. Genuine, relieved, beautiful. I know just the place, he said. 2 hours later, Sophie stood in front of her hotel suite's full-length mirror, questioning every choice she'd made in the last 24 hours. The emerald dress she'd impulsively packed hung perfectly on her curves, its silk fabric catching the light as she moved. She'd let her hair down from its usual professional bun, and the natural curls framed her face softly. A touch of makeup brought out the warmth in her brown eyes. She looked beautiful. She looked like a woman going on a date, not an assistant attending a business dinner. What am I doing? A knock at her door interrupted her internal panic. Daniel stood in the hallway and Sophie's breath caught. He'd changed into dark slacks and a navy blue button-down that made his eyes look almost electric. His hair was slightly mussed, as if he'd run his hands through it nervously. You look... He stopped, his eyes traveling over her in a way that made her skin warm. Sophie, you're beautiful. The simple honesty in his voice made her cheeks burn. Thank you. Shall we? The restaurant he'd chosen was nothing like what Sophie had expected. Instead of the high-end establishments where she imagined Daniel usually dined, it was an intimate rooftop garden overlooking the city, with twinkling lights strung between olive trees and the sound of jazz drifting from somewhere nearby. This is incredible, Sophie breathed, as they were led to a corner table where the city lights stretched out below them like fallen stars. "I discovered it by accident a few years ago," Daniel said, pulling out her chair. "Sometimes the best things happen when you're not looking for them." As they settled at their table, Sophie noticed how different Daniel seemed. Gone was the intense, commanding presence from the boardroom. This version of him was relaxed, attentive, charming in a way that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the man beneath the suit. "Tell me something I don't know about you," he said, as their wine arrived. Sophie laughed. "After 3 years as your assistant, I think you know everything about me. My coffee order, my schedule, probably my shoe size." "I know Sophie Miller, my assistant," Daniel said, leaning forward slightly. "I want to know Sophie Miller, the woman." The way he said it sent a shiver down her spine. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. What you dream about, what makes you laugh, what you do when you're not managing my life." So Sophie told him about the novel she'd been writing in secret, adding a few paragraphs each night after work, about her Sunday morning ritual of wandering through farmers' markets, even though her tiny apartment kitchen barely justified buying fresh vegetables, about how she'd learned to salsa dance at the community center near her apartment because she'd always loved the way couples moved together in old movies. "You dance?" Daniel asked, his eyes lighting up with interest. "A little. Not very well," Sophie admitted, feeling suddenly shy. "I'd love to see that sometime." The way he said it, soft, genuine, full of promise, made Sophie's pulse quicken. They were venturing into dangerous territory again, but this time she found herself less afraid and more curious about where it might lead. As the evening progressed, Daniel shared pieces of himself that Sophie had never glimpsed in their professional relationship. He told her about his mother, who died when he was 15, and how her absence had shaped his relationship with his demanding father. He talked about the pressure of living up to the Walker name, about nights when he questioned whether he was building something meaningful or just perpetuating his father's legacy. "Sometimes I feel like I'm playing a role," he admitted, as they shared a dessert that was almost too beautiful to eat. "The successful CEO, the eligible bachelor, the man who has everything figured out, but with you—" "With me what?" "With you I feel like I can just be Daniel, not Walker Industries, not my father's son, just me." Sophie felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the wine and everything to do with the vulnerability in his voice. "You are just Daniel," she said softly. "You always have been. Maybe you just needed someone to see it." When Daniel reached across the table and took her hand, Sophie didn't pull away. His thumb traced gentle circles across her knuckles, the same gesture from lunch, but now it felt different, more intentional, more like a promise. "Sophie," he said, his voice low and urgent, "I need you to know that tonight, this feeling, it's not something I take lightly. I don't do this. I don't blur lines with employees. I don't let people get close. I don't—" "Don't what?" "I don't fall for my assistant," he finished quietly. "But I'm falling for you, and I don't know how to stop it. I don't know if I want to stop it." Sophie's heart hammered against her ribs as she processed his words. This was it, the moment that would change everything between them, the moment that would define what happened next. "What if I told you I was falling too?" she whispered. Daniel's eyes searched her face, and what he saw there made him lean closer. "Then I'd say we're both in trouble. Good trouble or bad trouble?" "I don't know yet," he said honestly, "but I want to find out." When he lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, Sophie felt her carefully constructed walls crumble completely. Tomorrow would bring consequences, complications, reality, but tonight, under the Los Angeles stars with the city spread out below them like a promise, Sophie Miller allowed herself to fall. Some moments change everything that comes after. The elevator ride back to the hotel felt like an eternity. Sophie stood beside Daniel, acutely aware of the space between them, barely 6 inches that felt both too much and not nearly enough. Her hand still tingled where his lips had touched it, and every breath brought the familiar scent of his cologne mixed with something else, something that made her pulse race. "Sophie." Daniel's voice was soft in the elevator's quiet hum. She looked up to find him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. The golden glow of the elevator lights cast shadows across his face, highlighting the strong line of his jaw, the way his steel blue eyes seemed to see straight through her. "This is crazy," she whispered. "Completely," he agreed, but he didn't step away. Instead, he moved closer, his hand coming up to gently touch her cheek. "Tell me to stop." Sophie's heart hammered against her ribs, As she looked into his eyes, she should tell him to stop, should remind him that he was her boss, that this would complicate everything, that tomorrow would bring consequences they weren't prepared for. Instead, she found herself leaning into his touch. The elevator chimed softly as it reached their floor, breaking the spell. The doors slid open to reveal the plush carpeted hallway, and reality came rushing back. They walked to their adjacent suites in silence, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them. "Good night, Sophie," Daniel said softly as she reached for her keycard. "Good night." But neither of them moved. Sophie stood with her hand on the door handle, her back to Daniel, knowing he was still there, still watching her. The smart thing would be to go inside, to put the safety of a closed door between them and whatever this was becoming. "Daniel?" She turned slowly to face him. "Yes, I don't want this night to end." The words hung in the air between them like a confession. Daniel's eyes searched her face, and she saw her own uncertainty and desire reflected back at her. "Are you sure?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "Because once we cross this line, there's no going back to the way things were." Sophie thought about the careful professional distance she'd maintained for 3 years, about the walls she'd built to protect herself from exactly this moment. Then she thought about the man who had shared his vulnerabilities with her over dinner, who had looked at her like she was precious, who had made her feel seen in ways she'd never experienced before. "I'm sure," she said quietly. Daniel moved closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with infinite gentleness. "Sophie," he breathed her name like a prayer. When he leaned down to kiss her, time seemed to slow. His lips were soft against hers, tentative at first, as if he was giving her one last chance to change her mind. But when Sophie melted into him, when her hands found the front of his shirt and pulled him closer, the kiss deepened into something that spoke of months of hidden longing and carefully suppressed desire. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Daniel rested his forehead against hers. "My room or yours?" he asked softly. "Yours," Sophie whispered, and Daniel's smile was answer enough. His penthouse suite was everything Sophie had imagined, spacious, elegant, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city lights below, but she barely noticed the luxurious furnishings. All her attention was focused on Daniel as he moved to pour them each a glass of wine from the bottle that had been waiting on the table. "Two crossing lines," he said softly, handing her a glass. "To finding out what's on the other side," Sophie replied. They sipped their wine slowly, standing by the windows overlooking Los Angeles. The city sparkled below them like a constellation of possibilities, and Sophie felt as if they were suspended above the world, in a bubble where normal rules didn't apply. "I've thought about this," Daniel said quietly, his voice barely audible over the soft jazz playing from hidden speakers. "About you, more than I should have." "What did you think about?" Sophie asked, surprised by her own boldness. Daniel set down his wine glass and turned to face her fully. "Everything. The way you bite your lip when you're concentrating, how your eyes light up when you laugh, the way you always smell like vanilla and something else I could never identify." "Jasmine," Sophie said softly. "My perfume, jasmine," he repeated, as if committing it to memory. "I thought about what it would be like to tell you how beautiful you are, how intelligent, how you make me want to be a better man." Sophie felt tears prick at her eyes. No one had ever spoken to her like this, with such raw honesty and tenderness. "Daniel, I thought about kissing you," he continued, moving closer, "about holding you, about what it would feel like to wake up next to you." His words sent heat racing through her veins. Sophie set down her own glass with trembling hands. "Show me," she whispered. Daniel's eyes darkened with desire, but his touch remained infinitely gentle as he pulled her into his arms. This time, when he kissed her, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty. It was a kiss that spoke of promises and possibilities, of 3 years of suppressed longing finally set free. Sophie lost herself in the sensation of his mouth on hers, in the way his hands tangled in her hair, in the solid warmth of his body against hers. When he lifted her easily in his arms, she felt cherished, precious, desired in ways that made her heart race. The bedroom was bathed in soft moonlight, streaming through the windows. Daniel set her down gently beside the bed, his hands framing her face as he looked into her eyes. "Are you sure?" he asked one more time, his voice rough with want and tenderness. "I've never been more sure of anything," Sophie replied truthfully. What happened next was beautiful, passionate and tender, a perfect collision of desire and emotion that left them both breathless and changed. Daniel worshipped her with a reverence that made Sophie feel like the most precious thing in the world. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered word of adoration spoke of feelings that went far deeper than physical attraction. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the silk sheets, Sophie's head resting on Daniel's chest as his fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. The city lights continued to twinkle beyond the windows, but Sophie felt as if their world had narrowed to just this room, this bed, this perfect moment. "What happens now?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel's arms tightened around her. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I know I don't want this to be just one night." Sophie tilted her head to look at him. In the moonlight, with his hair mussed and his usual composed expression replaced by something softer and more vulnerable, he looked younger, more human. "Neither do I," she said. "Good," Daniel murmured, pressing a kiss to the top of her head, "because I'm not sure I could let you go now even if you wanted me to." Sophie smiled against his chest, feeling a contentment she'd never experienced before. Tomorrow would bring complications, conversations, decisions about what this meant for their professional relationship. But tonight, wrapped in Daniel's arms with the Los Angeles stars as their witnesses, Sophie allowed herself to believe in possibilities. Outside, the city hummed with late-night energy, oblivious to the fact that two people had just discovered something worth risking everything for. And as Sophie drifted off to sleep in Daniel's embrace, her last conscious thought was that some mistakes were too beautiful to regret. But even in her contentment, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered a warning about what the morning light might bring. Reality has a cruel way of shattering even the most beautiful dreams. Sophie woke to the soft sound of running water from the bathroom and the unfamiliar sensation of silk sheets against her skin. For a blissful moment, she floated in that space between sleep and consciousness, where the events of the night before felt like a beautiful dream. Then awareness crashed over her like a cold wave. She was in Daniel's bed, in Daniel Walker's bed, her boss's bed. The morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows seemed harsh and unforgiving, illuminating the emerald dress draped carelessly over a chair, her heels kicked off beside the bed, the evidence of the line they had crossed scattered around the room like accusers. "What have I done?" Sophie sat up carefully, pulling the sheet around herself as panic began to claw at her chest. In the harsh light of morning, everything that had felt magical and right just hours ago now seemed reckless and potentially career-destroying. 3 years. 3 years she had worked to build her reputation, to prove herself in a world where women like her had to work twice as hard to be taken seriously. 3 years of careful professionalism, of maintaining boundaries, of earning respect through competence and dedication. And she had thrown it all away for one night. The shower was still running, and Sophie could hear Daniel's voice as he spoke on what must be his phone, probably already conducting business, while most of the world was still sleeping. The sound of his voice, so familiar, yet now charged with new meaning, sent a confusing mix of warmth and terror through her. "He's going to think I'm just another conquest," the cruel voice in her head whispered. "Another woman who couldn't resist the powerful CEO. They'll probably laugh about it in boardrooms. The assistant who thought she was special." Sophie closed her eyes, remembering the way Daniel had looked at her last night, the tenderness in his voice when he'd called her beautiful, the reverence in his touch. That hadn't been fake, it couldn't have been, but morning light had a way of making even the most sincere moments seem like elaborate lies. The shower turned off, and Sophie's panic intensified. She couldn't face him. Not yet. Not until she figured out how to handle this disaster she'd created. Moving as quietly as possible, Sophie slipped from the bed and gathered her scattered clothes. Her hands shook as she pulled on the emerald dress that had made her feel so beautiful last night, and now felt like evidence of her poor judgment. She was reaching for her shoes when the bathroom door opened. "Sophie?" Daniel emerged with a towel wrapped around his waist, his hair damp, droplets of water still clinging to his chest. In the morning light, he was devastatingly handsome, and the sight of him sent an unwelcome jolt of desire through her despite her panic. But it was the expression on his face that made her heart clench. Soft, hopeful, vulnerable in a way she'd never seen from the commanding CEO she knew in New York. "You're leaving," he said, and it wasn't a question. I need to get back to my room, get ready for the flight." Sophie's voice sounded strange and distant to her own ears. Daniel moved closer, and Sophie caught the scent of his shower gel, something clean and masculine that made her want to step into his arms instead of toward the door. "Sophie, look at me." Reluctantly, she raised her eyes to his. The gentleness she saw there nearly undid her resolve. "Last night," he began, "was a mistake," Sophie said quickly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "A beautiful mistake, but still a mistake." Daniel's face went very still. "A mistake. You're my boss, Daniel. I'm your employee. This can't happen again. Can't, or you don't want it to." The quiet intensity in his voice made Sophie's chest tight. She wanted to tell him the truth, that she wanted it more than she'd ever wanted anything, that the thought of pretending last night never happened felt like losing something precious. But fear was louder than want. "Does it matter?" she said instead. Something flickered across Daniel's face. Hurt, disappointment, maybe anger. The vulnerable man from moments before was already retreating behind his familiar mask of control. "I suppose it doesn't," he said coolly. Sophie felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back. This was for the best. This was the smart choice. This was protecting both of them from a situation that could only end badly. "I'll see you at the airport," she said, heading for the door. "Sophie." She paused but didn't turn around. "For what it's worth," Daniel said quietly, "last night was the most real I've felt in years. If that was a mistake to you, then I'm sorry for misreading the situation." Sophie's heart shattered at the resignation in his voice, but she forced herself to keep walking. She made it to her own suite before the tears came, sliding down the door as sobs racked her body. She had done the right thing, the professional thing, the smart thing. So why did it feel like she had just made the biggest mistake of her life? An hour later, Sophie sat in the hotel lobby, her luggage beside her and her professional armor firmly back in place. She had showered, applied concealer to hide the evidence of her crying, and put her hair back in its usual neat bun. Her navy blazer was wrinkle-free, her expression composed, and to anyone looking, she was once again the efficient assistant waiting for her boss. But inside, she felt like she was fracturing. Daniel appeared exactly on time, looking every inch the successful businessman in his charcoal suit and silver tie. His face was a mask of professional politeness, giving no hint of the intimacy they had shared or the conversation in his suite. "Good morning, Sophie," he said formally. "Good morning, Mr. Walker." The return to surnames felt like a slap, but Sophie forced herself not to flinch. This was what she had chosen. This was what needed to happen. The car ride to the airport was excruciating. They sat in silence, both staring out their respective windows, the space between them feeling like an ocean. The easy intimacy of the previous day was gone, replaced by a tension so thick Sophie could barely breathe. On the plane, Daniel buried himself in work, while Sophie stared blindly at her tablet, the words blurring together as her mind replayed every moment of the night before. She kept stealing glances at him, remembering the way he had held her, the promises whispered in the dark, the look in his eyes when he'd told her she made him want to be a better man. 3 hours into the flight, Daniel closed his laptop and turned to her. "Sophie." She looked up, her heart jumping at the way he said her name. Not formal, not distant, but with the same gentleness as the night before. "Yes, Mr. Walker?" He winced slightly at the formal address. "Are we really going to pretend last night never happened?" Sophie's carefully constructed composure wavered. "I think that's best for everyone." "Best for everyone, or safest for you?" The quiet challenge in his voice made her look away. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do." Daniel leaned closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "I think you're scared. I think last night meant something to you, and that terrifies you." "You're my boss," Sophie said weakly. "I'm also the man who told you things I've never told anyone else. The man who held you while you slept. The man who—" He paused, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "The man who's falling in love with you." Sophie's breath caught. Love. He had said love. "Don't," she whispered. "Please don't make this harder than it already is." "Hard?" Daniel's laugh was bitter. "Sophie, the hardest thing would be pretending I don't feel this. Pretending last night was just physical. Pretending I don't want to spend every day getting to know you better. Every night holding you, every morning waking up beside you." Tears burned behind Sophie's eyes. "We can't. You know we can't." "Why? Because of what people will think? Because of office policies? Because you're afraid?" "Because I won't be your secret." The words burst out of her before she could stop them. "I won't be the woman you sleep with behind closed doors but ignore in public. I won't be someone you're ashamed of." Daniel's face went white. "Ashamed? Sophie, you think I'm ashamed of you, aren't you?" Sophie's voice cracked. "The powerful CEO and his assistant? The rich white man and the black woman from Detroit who serves him coffee? Stop. Daniel's voice was sharp with pain. Don't you dare reduce yourself to that. Don't you dare reduce what we have to that. What we have, Sophie laughed bitterly. We had one night, Daniel. One beautiful, impossible night that should never have happened. You're right, Daniel said quietly, and something in his tone made Sophie look at him sharply. It should never have happened, not like that. Not when you work for me, not when there's this power imbalance between us. Sophie felt something cold settle in her stomach. What are you saying? I'm saying that when we get back to New York, I'm going to fix this. I'm going to remove the obstacle that's keeping us apart. Daniel, you're fired, Sophie. The words hit her like a physical blow. Sophie stared at him, sure she had misheard. What? Effective immediately. You no longer work for Walker Industries. Daniel's voice was steady, businesslike, but his eyes were anything but. I'll provide you with an excellent reference, 6 months severance and assistance finding a new position. You're firing me. Sophie's voice was barely a whisper. Because we slept together. I'm firing you because I love you, Daniel said simply. And I won't let your fear or my position stand in the way of that. Sophie felt the world tilt around her. He was firing her, taking away her job, her livelihood, her carefully built career, all because of one night. How dare you, she breathed. How dare you make that decision for me? Sophie, no. She held up her hand, anger blazing through the shock. You think you can just wave your hand and fix everything? Fire me so your conscience is clear? So you can pursue the ex-employee without any professional complications? That's exactly what this is. Sophie's voice was rising, and she forced herself to lower it, acutely aware of the other passengers. You took my choice away. My job, my career, my agency. Gone, because Daniel Walker decided what was best for everyone. Daniel's face was pale. You thought wrong. Sophie turned away from him, staring out the window at the clouds below. Consider your offer declined, Mr. Walker. I quit. The rest of the flight passed in tense silence. By the time they landed in New York, Sophie had made her decision. She would write her resignation letter that evening and be gone from Walker Industries before Daniel could fire her. She would not let him take away the one thing she could still control, the choice to leave on her own terms. As they walked through JFK, Daniel tried one more time. Sophie, please, let me explain. There's nothing to explain, Sophie said without looking at him. You've made your position very clear. She hailed her own taxi, leaving Daniel standing alone beside the luggage carousel, looking like a man who had just lost everything. Because he had. Sometimes pride is the only armor left to protect a broken heart. Sophie's one-bedroom apartment in Queens had never felt smaller. She sat at her tiny kitchen table, laptop open, cursor blinking mockingly at the blank resignation letter she'd been trying to write for the past 2 hours. Outside her window, the October rain drummed against the glass, matching the rhythm of her fractured thoughts. Dear Mr. Walker, please accept this letter as my formal resignation. She deleted the line for the 5th time. How did you resign from a job where your boss had already tried to fire you? How did you maintain dignity when your heart was shattered and your career hung in the balance? Her phone buzzed with a text message, and Sophie's pulse jumped before she saw it was from her best friend Maya, not from the person she both desperately wanted and absolutely couldn't bear to hear from. Girl, you've been radio silent since LA. Everything okay? Sophie stared at the message. Maya Torres had been her roommate at Columbia and was now a successful marketing director at a tech startup. She was also the only person who knew about Sophie's complicated feelings for her boss, or at least she knew Sophie found Daniel attractive. She had no idea about Los Angeles, just work stuff. Call you later, don't make me come over there. You know I will. Despite everything, Sophie smiled slightly. Maya absolutely would show up at her door with wine and Chinese takeout if she thought Sophie was in trouble. It was both comforting and terrifying to have someone who cared that much. Sophie's laptop chimed with an email notification, and her heart stopped when she saw the sender, Daniel Walker. With trembling fingers, she opened it. Sophie, I know you don't want to speak with me, but please read this. I've been thinking about what happened on the plane, and I realize how my actions must have appeared to you. I handled everything wrong. I was trying to remove the obstacles between us, but instead I became one myself. I'm not firing you. I never should have said that. Your position at Walker Industries is secure for as long as you want it. The choice is yours. I would like to discuss this in person when you're ready. I'll be in the office tomorrow if you decide to come in. Respectfully, Daniel. Sophie read the email 3 times, her emotions churning between relief, anger, and something dangerously close to hope. He wasn't firing her, but he also wasn't apologizing for the way he'd tried to control the situation, wasn't acknowledging that his solution had been a complete violation of her autonomy. The choice is yours, except it wasn't, was it? Because either choice, staying or leaving, would be excruciating now. Staying meant seeing him every day, pretending Los Angeles never happened, watching him eventually move on with someone more suitable. Leaving meant walking away from the best job she'd ever had, and the man she was terrified to admit she might be falling in love with. Sophie closed the laptop and walked to her bedroom, catching sight of herself in the full-length mirror. She looked exhausted, hollow-eyed, like a woman who had spent the last 24 hours questioning every decision she'd ever made. The emerald dress from Los Angeles hung in her closet like an accusation. She should probably donate it, get rid of the reminder of that night. But when she reached for it, her fingers lingered on the silk fabric, remembering the way Daniel had looked at her when she wore it, the reverence in his voice when he'd called her beautiful. "Stop," she told herself firmly. "Stop torturing yourself." Her phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. Maya's name flashed on the screen. "Hey," Sophie answered, trying to sound normal. "Okay, that voice confirms it. I'm coming over. Order pizza." "Maya, you don't have to." "Sophie Elizabeth Miller, I've known you for 8 years. I know the difference between work stuff and whatever's happening right now. I'll be there in an hour." The line went dead, and Sophie couldn't help but smile despite her misery. Maya Torres was a force of nature, barely 5 feet tall but with enough determination to move mountains when someone she loved was hurting. An hour later, Maya stood in Sophie's doorway with 2 bottles of wine, a bag of Thai food, and an expression that brooked no argument. "Spill," she said, pushing past Sophie into the apartment, "and don't even think about lying to me." So Sophie told her everything. Los Angeles, the dinner, the night together, the devastating morning after, Daniel's attempt to fire her, the email. Maya listened without interrupting, her dark eyes growing wider with each revelation. When Sophie finished, Maya was quiet for a long moment. "Well," she said finally, pouring wine into 2 mismatched glasses, "that's either the most romantic thing I've ever heard or the most catastrophic. I'm leaning toward both." "It was a mistake," Sophie said, accepting the wine gratefully. "I should never have crossed that line." "Why, because he's your boss?" "Because he's Daniel Walker." Sophie took a large sip of wine. "Do you know what his last girlfriend looked like? Victoria Ashford, the pharmaceutical heiress. Blonde, Harvard MBA, owns a house in the Hamptons. That's his world, Maya, not mine." "Did Victoria Ashford make him laugh?" Maya asked quietly. "Did she know how he takes his coffee? What stresses him out? What makes him tick?" "That's not the point." "It's exactly the point." Maya leaned forward intently. "Sophie, you've spent 3 years getting to know this man better than anyone else in his life probably does. You've seen him at his worst and his best, and from what you've told me, he's seen the same in you. That doesn't matter. What happened in Los Angeles, it changed everything. I can't just go back to being his assistant and pretend I don't know what it feels like to—" Sophie's voice trailed off. "To be in love with him?" Sophie's head snapped up. "I'm not—" "Girl, please. I've been listening to you talk about Daniel Walker for 3 years. You light up when you mention him. You worry about him working too hard. You know his schedule better than your own. And that was before Los Angeles." "It doesn't matter how I feel," Sophie said quietly. "He tried to fire me, Maya, to take away my choice, my agency, everything I've worked for, because he thought he knew what was best for everyone." "That was stupid," Maya agreed. "Incredibly, monumentally stupid. But Sophie, maybe he was just scared too." Sophie looked at her friend sharply. "Scared? Think about it. You're telling me this powerful, controlled man had one perfect night with you, and then watched you run away in the morning calling it a mistake. Maybe his brain short-circuited. Maybe he was trying to fix something he didn't know how to handle. That doesn't excuse—" "No, it doesn't," Maya interrupted. "But it might explain it. The question is, what are you going to do now?" Sophie stared into her wine glass. "I don't know. I can't go back to the way things were. But I also can't just pretend this job doesn't matter to me. It's the best position I've ever had, Maya. I've worked so hard to get here. So don't go back to the way things were," Maya said simply. "Go forward. Figure out what you actually want, not what you think is safe or smart or appropriate. What if what I want is impossible? What if it's not?" Sophie spent the rest of the evening with Maya, talking through every angle, every fear, every possibility. By the time her friend left, Sophie felt marginally more human, though no less confused. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying Maya's words. What do you actually want? The answer was terrifying in its simplicity. She wanted Daniel, not just the night in Los Angeles, but everything that could come after. She wanted to explore whatever was growing between them, wanted to see if the connection they'd found could survive outside of hotel suites and stolen moments. But she also wanted him to fight for her, really fight, not by trying to control the situation or make unilateral decisions about her career, but by proving that she mattered to him beyond one perfect night. The next morning, Sophie dressed carefully in her most professional navy suit, pulled her hair back in its customary bun, and took the subway to Manhattan. She would go to work. She would face Daniel, and she would figure out how to have the conversation they should have had on the plane. Walker Industries' 42nd floor buzzed with its usual Monday morning energy. Sophie's temporary replacement, an efficient-looking woman in her 50s, looked up from Sophie's desk with a smile. Ms. Miller, Mr. Walker asked me to send you to his office as soon as you arrived. Sophie's heart hammered as she walked across the familiar space toward Daniel's office. Through the glass walls she could see him at his desk, head bent over documents, looking every inch the commanding CEO except for the slight tension in his shoulders that she'd learned to recognize as stress. She knocked softly on his door. Come in. Daniel looked up, and Sophie's breath caught at the relief that flashed across his face when he saw her. He looked tired, strained, like a man who hadn't slept any better than she had. Sophie. He stood immediately, his hands smoothing his tie in a gesture she recognized as nervousness. Thank you for coming in. We need to talk, Sophie said without preamble. Yes, we do. Daniel moved around his desk, but stopped a careful distance away from her. Sophie, I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually. You do. I handled everything wrong. On the plane, I was trying to fix something that I thought was broken, but I was really just trying to control a situation that scared me. Daniel's voice was quiet, earnest. I had no right to make decisions about your career without consulting you. No right to assume I knew what was best for you. Sophie studied his face, seeing genuine regret there. You tried to fire me. I thought I was removing obstacles. I thought if the professional dynamic wasn't an issue anymore, we could... He ran a hand through his hair. I wasn't thinking clearly. I was thinking with my heart instead of my head, and I made everything worse. Yes, you did. The position is yours for as long as you want it, Daniel said firmly. No conditions, no expectations beyond your professional duties. And if you decide you can't work here anymore because of what happened between us, I'll provide you with the best references and recommendations you could ask for. Sophie felt some of the tension in her chest ease. This was what she'd needed to hear. Not control, not assumptions, but respect for her choices. And what about Los Angeles? She asked quietly. Daniel's eyes searched her face. What about it? Are we going to pretend it never happened? Is that what you want? Sophie took a deep breath. This was it. The moment of truth. The choice between safety and possibility. No, she said simply. I don't want to pretend it never happened. But I also don't know how to move forward from here. Something shifted in Daniel's expression. Hope, maybe, or relief. Neither do I, he admitted. But Sophie, I meant what I said on the plane, about how I feel about you. You said you were falling in love with me. I said that because it's true. Daniel's voice was steady, sure. I know this is complicated. I know there are obstacles and concerns and 100 reasons why this might not work. But I also know that what I feel for you isn't going away, and I don't want it to. Sophie felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble again. Daniel, I'm not asking for an answer right now, he said quickly. I'm not asking you to risk anything else. I'm just asking, would you have dinner with me tonight, not as your boss, not as my assistant, just as Sophie and Daniel, two people who care about each other and want to figure out what that means. Sophie looked into his steel blue eyes and saw everything she'd been afraid to hope for. Respect, patience, and something deeper that made her heart race. One dinner, she said, echoing their conversation in Los Angeles. One dinner, Daniel agreed, and his smile was like sunrise after the longest night of her life. But this time, Sophie said firmly, we talk about everything, the complications, the concerns, the obstacles. No more assumptions, no more unilateral decisions. If we're going to do this, we do it as equals. Equals, Daniel said, and there was something like reverence in his voice. I wouldn't want it any other way. As Sophie left his office to return to her desk, she felt something she hadn't experienced in days. Hope. They had a long way to go, difficult conversations ahead, and no guarantees about where this path would lead. But for the first time since Los Angeles, Sophie Miller was ready to find out. Sometimes the second chance is scarier than the first. Sophie changed clothes 3 times before settling on a simple black dress that struck the right balance between elegant and understated. She wasn't trying to recreate the magic of Los Angeles. That emerald dress and that version of herself belonged to a different moment, a different hope. Tonight was about moving forward, not looking back. Daniel had suggested a small bistro in the village, the kind of place that valued discretion over flash. As Sophie walked through the narrow streets, her heels clicking against the cobblestones, she felt a mixture of anticipation and terror that reminded her of her first day at Walker Industries 3 years ago. She spotted him immediately through the restaurant's window, seated at a corner table, checking his phone with the focused intensity she knew so well. But when he looked up and saw her approaching, the businessman's mask slipped away, replaced by something softer, more uncertain. Sophie. He stood as she reached the table, and for a moment they both hesitated, unsure of the proper greeting. A handshake felt absurd, a hug too intimate. In the end, Daniel simply pulled out her chair with the same careful courtesy he'd shown that first night in Los Angeles. "Thank you," she said, settling into her seat. "This place is lovely." "It belonged to my grandmother's friend," Daniel said, sitting across from her. "She used to bring me here when I was a kid. It's uncomplicated." Sophie smiled at the word choice. Uncomplicated sounds perfect right now. They ordered wine, nothing too expensive. Nothing that carried the weight of seduction or grand gestures, just a simple Pinot Grigio that went well with conversation and honest intentions. "So," Daniel said, once their glasses were filled, "how do we do this?" "Carefully," Sophie replied, "honestly, like adults who respect each other." "I can do that." Daniel took a sip of his wine, studying her face in the candlelight. "You look beautiful, but you always do. That's not me trying to be charming, that's just true." Sophie felt warmth spread through her chest, but she kept her voice steady. "Thank you, but compliments aren't going to fix what went wrong between us." "No, they're not." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "So let's talk about what did go wrong, starting with my spectacular failure on the airplane." Sophie appreciated his directness. "You tried to control the situation instead of talking to me about it." "I did, and I need you to understand why, even though it doesn't excuse it." Daniel's voice was quiet, earnest. "Sophie, I've spent my entire adult life in control of my company, my schedule, my emotions, my relationships, everything planned, everything managed, everything safe. And then you walked into my office 3 years ago and slowly, without me even realizing it, you became the person I trusted most in the world, the person who knew me best, the person who—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "The person who made me want things I'd never thought I needed." Sophie felt her pulse quicken, but she forced herself to stay focused. "What kinds of things?" "Partnership, real intimacy, someone to come home to who actually knows who I am." Daniel's eyes met hers. "When we were in Los Angeles, when you were lying in my arms, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be for the first time in my life." The honesty in his voice made Sophie's chest tight. "Then why did you run when I panicked?" "Because I've never felt that vulnerable before, and it terrified me. When you called it a mistake, when you ran, I reverted to what I know. Control, management, problem-solving." Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "I thought if I could just remove the professional complications, we could start over. I thought I was being romantic." "You thought wrong." "I thought wrong," he agreed. "Sophie, I need you to know that I've never done anything like this before. I don't date employees, I don't mix business with personal feelings, I don't—" He gestured helplessly. "I don't fall in love." There was that word again. Love. It hung between them like a challenge. "Is that what this is?" Sophie asked quietly. "Love?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke his voice was barely above a whisper. "I think about you when I wake up. I think about you during board meetings. I think about you when I'm trying to fall asleep. I've memorized the way you laugh, the way you bite your lip when you're thinking, the way you say my name when you're exasperated with me." He paused. "If that's not love, it's something close enough to scare me." Sophie felt tears prick at her eyes. "Daniel, I know it's complicated. I know there are obstacles, and I know I've already hurt you by handling this badly. But Sophie, I also know that I don't want to spend the rest of my life wondering what could have been if I'd been brave enough to fight for this." Their food arrived, giving Sophie a moment to collect herself. The server, an elderly Italian woman with kind eyes, seemed to sense the gravity of their conversation and left them alone with minimal fuss. "My turn," Sophie said once they were alone again. "You want honesty? Here it is. Los Angeles wasn't a mistake. It was the most real, most beautiful night of my life. But it also terrified me because it felt too good to be true. Why? Because you're Daniel Walker. Because you're brilliant and successful and you could have anyone you want. Because Sophie struggled with the words. Because I'm just Sophie Miller from Detroit, and I've spent my whole life being told that girls like me don't get fairy tale endings with men like you. Daniel's face darkened. That's not true, isn't it? How many serious relationships have you had with women who weren't from your social circle? How many girlfriends didn't have trust funds or family connections or... None, Daniel said quietly. You're right. I've dated women who were safe choices, expected choices. Women who looked good at charity galas and fit into my world without challenging anything. Sophie felt her heart sink, despite having expected this answer. But Sophie, Daniel continued, those relationships were empty, pleasant, uncomplicated, and completely hollow. I never felt with any of them what I felt sitting across from you at lunch in Los Angeles. I never felt seen, or challenged, or alive. Pretty words, Sophie said, though her voice lacked conviction. Not words, truth. Daniel reached across the table, stopping just short of her hand. Sophie, you make me want to be the kind of man who deserves you. You make me want to be better than I am. I don't want you to change for me. Not change. Grow. There's a difference. Sophie looked down at his hand, so close to hers but not quite touching. What would this look like, if we tried? I don't know, Daniel admitted. We'd have to figure it out as we go, but I know what I want it to look like. Which is? I want to take you to dinner without worrying about who might see us. I want to bring you as my date to company events and be proud to have you on my arm. I want to wake up next to you on Sunday mornings and make you coffee and read the paper together. Daniel's voice grew softer. I want to introduce you to my family as the woman I love, not as my assistant. Sophie felt her defenses crumbling. Your family. My father, my sister, my cousins who think I'm too focused on work to ever settle down. I want them to know that I found someone extraordinary, someone who chose to love me not because of what I have, but because of who I am. The vulnerability in his voice undid her completely. Daniel, I know I'm asking for a lot. I know I've already proven I can mess this up spectacularly. But Sophie, if you're willing to take a chance on us, I promise I'll spend every day proving that you made the right choice. Sophie finally let him take her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, in a gesture that felt both familiar and electric. What about work? She asked practically. The office gossip, the power dynamics, We'll figure it out. Maybe we need to establish some professional boundaries, some rules about how we interact at the office versus how we are outside of it. Maybe you eventually transition to a different role in the company, something that showcases your talents better. Maybe, Daniel squeezed her hand gently, maybe we trust that if this is real, we'll find a way to make it work. Sophie studied his face in the candlelight, seeing hope and fear and determination there. This man, who commanded boardrooms and closed impossible deals, was asking her to take a leap of faith with him. One condition, she said finally, anything. No more unilateral decisions. No more trying to control situations or fix problems without talking to me first. If we do this, we're partners, equals, in everything. Partners, Daniel agreed, bringing her hand to his lips for the gentlest of kisses. I like the sound of that. Sophie felt a smile tug at her lips for the first time in days. So what happens now? Now we take this one day at a time, one conversation at a time, one choice at a time. Daniel's eyes sparkled with something that looked like mischief. And now, Sophie Miller, I'd very much like to kiss you. Here, in public. Here, in public, because I'm not hiding how I feel about you anymore. Sophie looked around the intimate bistro, at the other couples dining quietly, at the understanding smile on their server's face. One kiss, she said, echoing their pattern of careful negotiations. One kiss, Daniel agreed, but the promise in his eyes suggested it would be anything but simple. When he leaned across the table and kissed her softly, Sophie felt the last of her walls crumble completely. This wasn't the desperate passion of Los Angeles or the confusion of morning after regrets. This was a choice, conscious and deliberate and full of possibility. When they broke apart, both breathing slightly harder, Daniel rested his forehead against hers. Still feel like a mistake? He asked softly. No, Sophie whispered. "It feels like the beginning of something beautiful." And for the first time since Los Angeles, Sophie Miller believed that maybe, just maybe, she deserved her own fairy tale ending after all. The first test of love isn't passion, it's facing whispers and judgment together. Sophie woke up to the sound of her phone buzzing insistently on her nightstand. For a moment, she lay in bed, remembering the warmth of Daniel's goodnight kiss at her building's entrance, the hope that had filled her chest as she'd fallen asleep. Then reality crashed back in. Today would be their first day back at the office since their dinner, since their decision to try being together. Today they would have to navigate the careful balance between their personal relationship and their professional responsibilities. Her phone showed 3 missed calls from Maya and several text messages. "Girl, you better call me back. I need details about last night. Did you guys figure things out? I'm bringing coffee to your office if you don't respond soon." Sophie smiled, despite her nerves. Maya's protective friendship was exactly what she needed right now. The subway ride to Manhattan felt different today. Sophie found herself analyzing every decision: what to wear, her most professional navy suit; how to style her hair, the usual neat bun; how to act around Daniel, completely professional, no matter how her heart raced when she saw him. Walker Industries' 42nd floor buzzed with its usual Monday morning energy. Sophie settled into her familiar chair and booted up her computer, falling into the routine motions that had defined her life for 3 years. Checking Daniel's calendar, reviewing emails, organizing priorities. "Sophie?" She looked up to find Jennifer from HR standing beside her desk, her expression friendly but professional. "Could we chat privately for a few minutes?" Sophie's stomach dropped. This was it. The conversation about workplace policies, about inappropriate relationships, about her future at Walker Industries. "Of course," Sophie said, following Jennifer to a small conference room. "I wanted to touch base with you about company policy regarding personal relationships," Jennifer began carefully. "Mr. Walker mentioned that you two have developed a personal connection outside of work." Sophie felt heat rise in her cheeks. "He told you?" "He wanted to be transparent and ensure that we handle everything appropriately." Jennifer smiled reassuringly. "Sophie, you've been an exemplary employee for 3 years. Your performance reviews are outstanding. Your colleagues respect you and your contributions to this company are well documented. But," Sophie prompted, waiting for the other shoe to drop, "but I do need to ask, do you feel your working relationship with Mr. Walker has been compromised in any way? Any pressure, any situations that make you uncomfortable?" Sophie thought about Daniel's attempt to fire her, about his controlling impulses, about the conversation they'd had that morning about handling things professionally. "No," she said honestly. "If anything, he's been more respectful of my boundaries since this developed." "Good. Then as far as HR is concerned, you'll continue in your current role. We just ask that you both maintain professional conduct during work hours and be mindful of how your relationship might be perceived by colleagues." The rest of the morning passed quietly, but Sophie could feel something different in the office atmosphere. Conversations seemed to pause when she walked by, and she caught curious glances from co-workers who had never paid much attention to her before. At 10:30, Daniel emerged from his office for his usual morning briefing. Sophie looked up as he approached her desk, and for a moment, their eyes met. She saw warmth there, affection, and a question. "Are you okay?" "Ms. Miller," he said formally, "could you bring me the quarterly reports for review?" "Of course, Mr. Walker." As she handed him the files, their fingers brushed briefly. It was the smallest touch, barely noticeable to anyone watching, but Sophie felt the electricity of it shoot up her arm. "Thank you," he said, his voice neutral, professional. But his eyes held hers for just a moment longer than necessary. Just as Daniel was turning to go back to his office, the elevator chimed, and Alice Kurt stepped out. Sophie's blood ran cold. Alice, blonde, elegant, everything Sophie wasn't, strode across the floor like she owned it, her designer heels clicking against the marble. She was exactly the kind of woman Daniel used to date, the kind who belonged in his world without question. "Daniel!" Alice's voice carried across the office, drawing every eye to her. "I was hoping to catch you before your 11 o'clock. Sophie watched Daniel's face carefully, looking for any sign of, what? Lingering attraction? Regret? But his expression remained politely professional. "Alice, I wasn't expecting you." I know. I should have called first." Alice's laugh was perfectly cultivated, the kind taught in finishing schools. "But I was in the neighborhood, and I wanted to discuss the Pemberton Foundation Gala. We still need to finalize the speaker lineup." Sophie felt invisible as Alice continued talking, her attention completely focused on Daniel. This was how it had always been. Sophie managing Daniel's schedule while women like Alice commanded his personal attention. "Ms. Miller handles my calendar," Daniel said, glancing towards Sophie. "She can coordinate with your assistant to find a suitable time to discuss the gala." Alice's gaze shifted to Sophie for the first time, her smile polite but dismissive. "Of course, though this is really something that requires your personal input, Daniel. Perhaps we could discuss it over lunch." Sophie felt her chest tighten. This was exactly the kind of situation she'd been dreading, watching Daniel navigate between his old world and whatever new world they were trying to build together. "I'm afraid my schedule is completely booked today," Daniel said smoothly. "Ms. Miller, could you find time later this week for a brief meeting with Ms. Kurt about the foundation?" "Certainly," Sophie said, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. "I'll have some options to you by end of day, Ms. Kurt." Alice's smile never wavered, but Sophie caught a flicker of something, curiosity, assessment, in her eyes as she looked between Sophie and Daniel. "Wonderful. I'll look forward to hearing from you." Alice turned back to Daniel. "You look well, Daniel, very content." "Thank you. If you'll excuse me, I have a conference call starting shortly." After Alice left, the office seemed to exhale collectively. Sophie busied herself with her computer, trying to process what had just happened. Daniel had been professional, appropriate, but he'd also made it clear that Sophie was his point of contact for everything, including his social obligations. "Sophie." She looked up to find Melissa from accounting standing beside her desk, her expression sympathetic but curious. "Could I ask you something? Privately?" Sophie nodded, though her stomach clenched with apprehension. "Is it true? About you and Mr. Walker?" "I'm sorry?" "Come on, Sophie. Half the office saw how he looked at you during that exchange with Alice Kurt. And Jennifer from HR was asking questions about workplace relationship policies." Melissa leaned closer. "We've all wondered if there was something there. You two have this connection." Sophie felt her cheeks burn. "I don't know what you mean." "Look, I'm not judging. Actually, most of us think it's kind of romantic. You've been here longer than any of his other assistants. You clearly know him better than anyone, and he's definitely different around you." Melissa smiled genuinely. "I just wanted to say that if it's true, I think it's great. You're good for him." Before Sophie could respond, Melissa was walking away, leaving Sophie to wonder how obvious their feelings had been, even before Los Angeles. The afternoon brought more of the same, subtle glances, whispered conversations that stopped when she approached, and a growing awareness that her relationship with Daniel was becoming the office's favorite topic of speculation. At 4 o'clock, Daniel emerged from his final meeting of the day. Sophie looked up as he approached her desk, and she could see the strain around his eyes that suggested his day had been as emotionally exhausting as hers. "Ms. Miller, could you stay a few minutes after hours today? I'd like to review tomorrow's schedule." "Of course, Mr. Walker." By 6 o'clock, the office had emptied except for security and the cleaning crew. Daniel closed his office door and immediately moved to where Sophie was gathering her things. "How are you holding up?" he asked softly, his formal mask finally dropping. "I'm okay, it's just strange, feeling like everyone's watching us, analyzing every interaction." "I know." And Alice showing up didn't help. Sophie looked at him sharply. "She was beautiful, elegant, everything I'm not." "She's everything you're not," Daniel agreed, and Sophie's heart sank until he continued. "She's predictable, superficial, and completely wrong for me." Sophie, seeing her today just reminded me of how empty those relationships were. "Really?" "Really." Daniel moved closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne. "Can I tell you something?" Sophie nodded. "When she was talking to me, all I could think about was how much I wanted her to leave so I could focus on you again. How much I wanted to tell her that the reason I look content is because I'm falling in love with the most incredible woman I've ever met." Sophie felt tears prick at her eyes. "Daniel, I know we said we'd keep things professional at work, and we will, but I needed you to know that there's no comparison, Sophie. There never was." "This is going to be hard," Sophie said quietly. "The gossip, the speculation, people judging whether I deserve to be with you." "Let them judge," Daniel said firmly. "I know what I feel, and I know what you mean to me. That's all that matters." "Is it? What about your board of directors, your clients, your social obligations? What about them?" Alice mentioned a gala. "There will be events, dinners, parties where I don't fit in, where people will wonder what you're doing with your assistant." Daniel cupped her face gently. "Sophie, you fit in everywhere because you're exceptional, and anyone who can't see that isn't worth my time or yours." Sophie leaned into his touch, feeling some of her anxiety ease. Promise me something. Anything. Promise me that if this gets too complicated, if it starts affecting your business or your reputation, you'll tell me. Don't try to protect me from the truth. I promise, Daniel said, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. But Sophie, I'm not going anywhere. Whatever challenges come, we face them together. As they left the building together, walking side by side but not touching, Sophie felt a mixture of hope and trepidation. Today had been their first test and they'd survived it, but she couldn't shake the feeling that much bigger challenges were waiting just around the corner. When love is tested, it either breaks or becomes unbreakable. 2 weeks had passed since their dinner at the village bistro, 2 weeks of carefully navigated professional interactions and stolen moments after hours. Sophie had begun to believe they might actually make this work until the call came on a rainy Thursday afternoon that changed everything. Sophie, I need you to cancel my afternoon appointments, Daniel said, emerging from his office with his phone pressed to his ear and his face pale. My father's in the hospital. Sophie was on her feet immediately, her personal feelings forgotten in the face of his obvious distress. What happened? Is he okay? Heart attack. They're saying it's serious. Daniel was already reaching for his coat, his usual composure cracking. I need to get to Boston immediately. I'll arrange a car and reschedule everything, Sophie said, her fingers already flying over her keyboard. Do you want me to book a hotel? Arrange for... Come with me. The words stopped Sophie mid-sentence. Daniel was standing beside her desk, his steel blue eyes intense with something between desperation and hope. Daniel, I don't think... Please. His voice was quiet, vulnerable in a way she'd rarely heard. I know it's complicated. I know it's not professional, but Sophie, I need you there. Not as my assistant, as the woman I love. Sophie felt her heart clench at the raw honesty in his voice. Your family doesn't know about us. About me. They will soon enough. Daniel moved closer, lowering his voice. Sophie, I've spent my whole life trying to live up to my father's expectations, trying to be the son he wanted. But right now all I can think about is that I might lose him before he gets to meet the woman who changed everything for me. Sophie looked into his eyes and saw fear there, not just for his father, but for what this moment might cost them. This was it, the moment when their private relationship would become public in the most high-stakes way possible. Okay, she said quietly. I'll come with you. The drive to Boston passed in tense silence. Daniel sat rigid in the back seat of the town car, his hands clenched into fists, staring out at the grey October landscape. Sophie wanted to reach for him, to offer comfort, but she wasn't sure how to bridge the gap between Sophie the assistant and Sophie the girlfriend in this liminal space. Tell me about him, she said finally. Your father. Daniel was quiet for so long that Sophie thought he hadn't heard her. Then he spoke, his voice soft with memory. Robert Walker built the company from nothing, started with a small construction firm in Southie and turned it into one of the largest real estate development companies on the East Coast. Daniel's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. He's brilliant, demanding, impossible to please, and completely devoted to his family. Sounds familiar, Sophie said gently, and Daniel actually laughed. He's going to like you, he said, turning to look at her fully for the first time since they'd left New York. He's going to like that you're smart enough to challenge me, strong enough to stand up to me, and kind enough to love me anyway. What if he doesn't? What if your whole family thinks I'm just some gold digger who's taking advantage of you? Daniel reached across the seat and took her hand, intertwining their fingers. Then they don't know me as well as they think they do. Massachusetts General Hospital buzzed with the controlled chaos of a major medical center. Daniel strode through the corridors with the purposeful intensity Sophie recognized from his business dealings, but she could see the fear beneath his composed exterior. Excuse me, he said to the nurse at the cardiac unit desk. I'm looking for Robert Walker. I'm his son. Room 314, the nurse said kindly. The doctor will want to speak with you before you go in. Doctor? Martinez was a small, efficient woman with kind eyes and steady hands. Mr. Walker, your father is stable for now, but it was a significant cardiac event. We're monitoring him closely, and we'll know more in the next 24 hours. Can I see him? Of course, but please keep visits brief and calm. He needs rest. Daniel hesitated outside room 314, his hand on the door handle. Sophie could see him gathering himself, preparing to face whatever waited inside. I'll wait out here, she said softly. No. Daniel's voice was firm. We go in together. Carlos Walker was smaller than Sophie had expected, diminished by the hospital bed and the monitors surrounding him. But even unconscious, there was something formidable about him, something that spoke of strength and determination, that had built an empire from nothing. "Dad?" Daniel's voice was softer than Sophie had ever heard it. Carlos's eyes fluttered open, focusing slowly on his son. "Daniel, you came." "Of course I came. How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck." Robert's voice was hoarse but determined. "But I'm too stubborn to die yet." Daniel laughed, but Sophie could hear the relief in it. "Good. The company can't afford to lose you." "The company will be fine. It's got you." Robert's gaze shifted past Daniel to Sophie, standing quietly by the door. "And who's this?" Sophie felt her heart hammer as Daniel turned to her, extending his hand in invitation. This was it, the moment of truth. "Dad, I'd like you to meet Sophie Miller. She's—" Daniel paused and Sophie held her breath. "She's the woman I'm going to marry." Sophie's eyes widened in shock. They'd never discussed marriage, never even talked about a future beyond navigating their current complications. But Daniel was looking at her with such certainty, such love, that she felt her heart stop and restart. "Sophie Miller," Carlos repeated, his sharp eyes studying her with the intensity of a man accustomed to making quick assessments. "Come here, young lady." Sophie moved closer to the bed, acutely aware of her simple black dress and practical shoes in this world of wealth and privilege. "So you're the one who's got my son walking around looking like he won the lottery," Carlos said, and Sophie caught a hint of Daniel's charm in his father's smile. "I'm sorry? Daniel's been different these past few months, happier, more human. I was wondering what had caused the change." Robert's eyes crinkled. "Now I know. Mr. Walker, Carlos," he corrected. "And tell me, Sophie Miller, what do you do when you're not making my son happy?" Sophie felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm his assistant, actually. His personal assistant." Carlos's eyebrows rose, but not with disapproval, with what looked like amusement. "His assistant? Well, that's interesting." "Dad," Daniel's voice carried a warning. "What?" "I think it's wonderful. She knows exactly what she's getting into." Carlos turned back to Sophie. "How long have you been putting up with him?" 3 years, sir. 3 years of managing his schedule, his moods, his impossible standards, and you still agreed to marry him." Carlos chuckled, then winced as the movement pulled at his monitors. "Daniel, you'd better hold on to this one. She's either a saint or insane." "I'm going with insane," Sophie said, before she could stop herself, and Carlos's laugh was so much like Daniel's that she felt some of her tension ease. "I like her," Carlos declared. "She's got spirit. When's the wedding?" Sophie and Daniel exchanged glances. "We haven't exactly," Daniel began, "set a date yet," Sophie finished smoothly. "We wanted to make sure you were well enough to walk me down the aisle." The words were out before Sophie realized what she'd said. Carlos's face lit up with genuine joy, and Daniel was staring at her with an expression of wonder and love that made her heart race. "I'd be honored," Carlos said softly, "though you might want to ask your own father first." "My father would be thrilled to share the honor," Sophie said, surprising herself with how natural the words felt. A knock at the door interrupted them. A tall woman with Daniel's eyes and an elegant bearing stepped into the room, followed by a man who was clearly her husband. "Daniel!" The woman rushed to embrace him. "We came as soon as we heard." "Kelly, Caleb," Daniel said, returning his sister's hug. "How did you get here so fast?" "We were already in Boston for Caleb's conference. Dad, how are you feeling?" "Much better now that I've met my future daughter-in-law," Carlos said, with obvious satisfaction. Kelly's eyes widened as she noticed Sophie for the first time. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize—" "Kelly, Caleb, this is Sophie Miller," Daniel said, his arm sliding around Sophie's waist in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. "Sophie, my sister Kelly and her husband Caleb." Sophie could see Kelly doing rapid calculations, taking in Sophie's appearance, her obvious nervousness, the way Daniel was holding her like she was precious. "Sophie Miller," Kelly repeated. "Have we met before?" "I'm Daniel's assistant," Sophie said simply. "Assistant." Kelly's voice was carefully neutral, but Sophie caught the flicker of surprise in her eyes. "Well, this is unexpected." "Kelly?" Daniel's voice carried a warning, but Sophie stepped forward. "It's okay," she said quietly. "I know this is a lot to process. I know I'm not what you probably expected for Daniel." "What I expected," Kelly said slowly, "was someone who would make my brother happy." And looking at him right now, she studied Daniel's face, seeing something there that made her expression soften. "I can see that you do." "She does," Daniel said simply. "More than I ever thought possible." "Then welcome to the family," Kelly said, stepping forward to embrace Sophie, And I'm sorry if I seemed shocked, it's just that Daniel's never brought anyone to meet Dad before. Ever. Never. Sophie looked at Daniel in surprise. Never, Carlos confirmed, which tells me everything I need to know about how serious he is about you. The next few hours passed in a blur of hospital routine and family dynamics. Sophie found herself fielding questions from nurses who assumed she was family, coordinating with doctors alongside Kelly, and somehow becoming an integral part of the Walker family crisis management team. It was nearly midnight when Daniel finally convinced everyone to go back to their hotels and get some rest. Carlos was stable, the doctors were optimistic, and visiting hours were over. "You should go back to New York," Daniel said as they stood in the hospital lobby. "You've already done more than—" "Don't." Sophie's voice was firm. "Don't you dare try to send me away now. We're in this together, remember?" Daniel studied her face in the harsh fluorescent lighting. "Sophie, what you said in there about the wedding, about my father walking you down the aisle, did you mean it?" Sophie felt her heart race. "Did you mean it when you told your father I was the woman you were going to marry?" "I meant it more than I've ever meant anything in my life," Daniel said quietly. "Sophie, I know we haven't talked about it. I know it's fast, but when I thought I might lose my father today, all I could think about was how much I wanted him to know that I'd found you, that I'd found love. Daniel, I'm not asking you to say yes right now. I'm not even asking you to wear a ring. I'm just asking if you can see it. A future where we're not just figuring this out day by day, but actually building something permanent together." Sophie looked into his eyes and saw her own hopes reflected back at her. 6 months ago, she'd been his efficient assistant, invisible and professional. Now she was standing in a Boston hospital lobby, being claimed as family by a man she'd never dared to dream she could have. "I can see it," she said softly. "I want to see it." Daniel's smile was radiant as he pulled her into his arms, right there in the middle of the hospital lobby, not caring who might see or what they might think. "I love you, Sophie Miller," he whispered against her hair. "I love you too," she whispered back, "even if you are completely insane for wanting to marry your assistant." "Especially because I'm insane enough to marry my assistant," Daniel corrected, and Sophie could hear the smile in his voice. As they walked out of the hospital together, hand in hand, Sophie realized that somewhere between Los Angeles and Boston, between panic and hope, between professional distance and personal intimacy, she had stopped being just Daniel Walker's assistant. She had become the woman he wanted to spend his life with, and for the first time since this all began, that felt like exactly who she was meant to be. True strength isn't about fitting in, it's about standing proud in who you are. 3 months later, Sophie stood in front of her bathroom mirror, her reflection radiating confidence and elegance. Tonight was the Pemberton Foundation Gala, Daniel's first major social event since Boston, and the first time she would appear publicly as his girlfriend rather than his assistant. Maya had spent the afternoon helping her get ready, transforming Sophie's small Queens apartment into a makeshift salon. The midnight blue dress hanging on her closet door was stunning, elegant, sophisticated, and chosen by Sophie herself after she'd politely declined Daniel's offer to buy her something. She was perfectly capable of investing in her own wardrobe, thank you very much. "You look like royalty," Maya said from the doorway, her voice filled with pride. "I feel like myself," Sophie corrected, adjusting her grandmother's pearl necklace with steady hands. "Just the best version of myself." "That's exactly who Daniel fell in love with," Maya reminded her. "Don't you forget it." A knock at the door interrupted them. Daniel stood in her hallway, looking devastating in his black tuxedo, his steel blue eyes warm with admiration as he took in her appearance. "You're absolutely stunning," he said simply. "Thank you. You clean up pretty well yourself," Sophie replied, with a confident smile that made Daniel's breath catch. "Sophie, are you ready for this?" The question carried weight beyond the evening ahead. "I've been ready for this my whole life," Sophie said, surprising both of them with the certainty in her voice. "I've worked hard to get where I am. I know who I am, and I'm proud of what we've built together." The Plaza Ballroom glittered with old money elegance, but Sophie walked in like she owned the place. She'd grown up in Detroit, worked her way through Columbia, and earned her position at one of New York's most prestigious companies through merit and determination. This was just another room full of people, and she'd never let anyone make her feel less than worthy. "Breathe," Daniel murmured as they paused at the ballroom entrance. "I am breathing," Sophie replied with a radiant smile, "and I'm excited to meet everyone." The first hour flew by in engaging conversations and genuine connections. Sophie found herself discussing economic policy with a senator's wife, sharing travel stories with a museum director, and even offering career advice to a young woman just starting in finance. Daniel watched her work the room with growing amazement and pride. "Daniel," Richard Pemberton approached with a warm smile. "Good to see you, son. How's your father?" "Much better, thank you. He's actually planning to be back in the office part-time next month." Daniel's arm settled proudly around Sophie's waist. "Richard, I'd like you to meet Sophie Miller. Sophie, this is Richard Pemberton, our host for the evening." "Mr. Pemberton, what a pleasure," Sophie said, extending her hand with poise. "Thank you for hosting such a beautiful event. The work the Pemberton Foundation does with education initiatives is truly inspiring." Richard's eyes lit up. "You're familiar with our work?" "Of course. I've been following your scholarship program for first-generation college students. It's exactly the kind of investment that changes lives." Sophie's passion was evident. "My parents would have been thrilled to see programs like yours when I was applying to colleges." "Are you in the development business as well?" Richard asked, clearly impressed. "Actually, I'm Daniel's personal assistant, but I've been involved in operations strategy and client relations for the past 3 years. Sophie's voice carried no shame, only pride. "It's taught me that the most successful businesses are built on strong foundations and attention to detail." Richard nodded approvingly. "The best assistants are the unsung heroes of any organization. Daniel's lucky to have found someone with such insight and dedication." "I'm the lucky one," Sophie said, glancing at Daniel with genuine affection. "I get to work with brilliant people and learn something new every day." As Richard moved away, Daniel stared at Sophie with unconcealed admiration. "Have I mentioned lately that you're incredible?" "You could mention it more often," Sophie replied with a playful smile that made him laugh. The evening continued with Sophie charming everyone she met. She discussed art with collectors, shared business insights with entrepreneurs, and even helped mediate a disagreement between 2 board members with diplomatic grace that left both parties satisfied. It was during the silent auction that Alice Kurt made her move. Sophie was examining a beautiful watercolor of the New England coast when she heard the familiar voice behind her. "Well, well, Sophie Miller." Sophie turned with a serene smile. Alice stood there in a silver gown, her expression carefully crafted to look sympathetic. "Alice, hello. You look lovely tonight." "Thank you. I must say I'm surprised to see you here. These events can be quite overwhelming for newcomers." Sophie's smile never wavered. "On the contrary, I'm finding it delightful. There are so many accomplished people here with fascinating stories." Alice moved closer, lowering her voice. "Sophie, I was hoping we could have a little chat, woman to woman." "Of course, what's on your mind?" "I've known Daniel for years, and I've seen him go through phases. He gets fascinated by something different, something that challenges his worldview." Alice's tone was condescending, designed to plant seeds of doubt. Sophie listened politely, then responded with quiet confidence. "Alice, I appreciate whatever concern you think you're showing, but you're operating under a fundamental misunderstanding." "Am I?" "You seem to think Daniel rescued me from obscurity, or that I'm some charity case he's taken on." Sophie's voice remained calm, but gained steel. "The truth is, I've been managing his professional life for 3 years. I know his business better than most of his board members. I've contributed to strategies that have saved his company millions, and I've earned every opportunity I've been given." Alice blinked, clearly not expecting this response. Sophie continued, her voice growing stronger. "You also seem to think I'm trying to fit into his world, but here's what you don't understand. I'm not trying to fit into anything. I'm building something new with Daniel, something based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine partnership. But surely you must realize the differences between you, the differences between us?" Sophie's laugh was genuinely amused. "Alice, those differences are exactly what make us strong. He brings his experience and resources. I bring my perspective and determination. He challenges me to dream bigger. I challenge him to stay grounded. That's not a phase, that's a partnership." Alice's composure was starting to crack. "People will always see you as what? A woman who worked her way up from nothing? A daughter of immigrants who put herself through Columbia? Someone who built a career based on competence rather than connections?" Sophie's eyes sparkled with pride. "Good. That's exactly who I am, and I wouldn't change a single thing about my journey. Daniel will eventually want someone more suitable." Sophie stepped closer, her voice carrying quiet authority. "Alice, I think you're projecting your own fears onto my relationship. Maybe Daniel grew tired of what you offered, but that says nothing about what he and I have built together." Alice's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Here's the thing, Sophie continued, her tone remaining kind but firm. I didn't choose Daniel because he's wealthy or powerful. I chose him because he's kind, because he challenges me intellectually, because he sees my worth and celebrates it. And he didn't choose me as some exotic experiment. He chose me because I make him laugh, because I call him on his nonsense, and because I love him for who he is, not what he has. Sophie paused, letting her words sink in. So, while I appreciate your concern, I'm exactly where I belong. Not because I'm trying to fit into Daniel's world, but because we're creating our own world together. With that, Sophie turned back to the painting, effectively dismissing Alice, who stood there for a moment before walking away with whatever dignity she had left. Daniel appeared at Sophie's side moments later, having witnessed the entire exchange from across the room. I've never been more proud of anyone in my entire life, he said quietly. Good, Sophie replied with a radiant smile, because I've never been more proud of myself. Sophie Miller, you are absolutely magnificent. I know, Sophie said with playful confidence. The question is, are you ready to spend the rest of your life with a woman who knows her own worth? Daniel's answer was to pull her into his arms, right there in the middle of the gala, and kiss her, like she was the most precious thing in the world. The rest of the evening was a triumph. Sophie continued to charm everyone she met, and Daniel watched with growing amazement as the woman he loved showed the entire room exactly why she belonged at his side, not as an accessory, but as an equal partner. In the car ride home, Sophie kicked off her heels and curled up beside Daniel, with the satisfaction of a woman who had faced her biggest test and emerged victorious. So, Daniel said, stroking her hair, how does it feel to conquer New York society? It feels like Tuesday, Sophie replied with a laugh. Daniel, I never needed their approval to know who I am. I just needed to remember it myself. And what did you remember? Sophie looked up at him with eyes bright with confidence and love. That I'm Sophie Miller from Detroit. I put myself through college, I built a career, I earned my place in your life, and I'm not apologizing to anyone for any of it. I love you, Daniel said simply. I love you too, Sophie replied. All of you. Your ambition, your kindness, your terrible habit of working too late, and yes, even your ridiculously expensive lifestyle that I'm still getting used to. Just getting used to? Sophie grinned. Well, I did look pretty good in diamonds tonight. Daniel's laughter filled the car as they drove through the city toward their future. A future built not on Sophie trying to become someone else, but on both of them becoming the best versions of themselves together. And if Alice Kurt was somewhere in the city licking her wounds and wondering how she'd been so thoroughly outmaneuvered by an assistant from Detroit, well, that was just an added bonus. 2 years later, the morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of their Upper East Side penthouse, casting golden light across the marble kitchen island, where Sophie Walker, she still got a thrill from her new surname, was making coffee in Daniel's old Columbia t-shirt and nothing else. She could hear the shower running in their master suite and smiled, remembering how just 2 years ago she'd been terrified to stay over in his hotel room. Now this elegant space filled with their combined belongings felt like the most natural thing in the world. The kitchen was a perfect blend of both their styles, Daniel's love of clean, modern lines, and Sophie's insistence on warmth and comfort. Family photos lined the marble countertops, their wedding day with both sets of parents beaming, Carlos walking her down the aisle with tears in his eyes, Maya's ridiculous maid-of-honor speech, and her favorite, a candid shot from their honeymoon in Santorini, where they were both laughing at something completely silly. Good morning, beautiful. Daniel's voice came from behind her as strong arms wrapped around her waist. Morning, husband, Sophie replied, leaning back against his chest as he nuzzled her neck. Even after 2 years of marriage, the word still made her heart flutter. What's on your agenda today, Mrs. Walker? He murmured against her ear in a way that made her consider cancelling all her meetings. Board presentation at 10, lunch with Maya at noon, and... Sophie turned in his arms with a mischievous smile. Dinner with your parents at 7. Your mother specifically requested I bring my famous lasagna. My mother adores you more than she adores me, Daniel said, pressing soft kisses along her jaw, which is both wonderful and mildly insulting. She's been asking when we're going to give her grandchildren again, Sophie said, watching Daniel's face carefully. His eyes darkened with something that made her pulse race. And what did you tell her? That we're still practicing, Sophie replied with a grin that made Daniel groan. Sophie Walker, you're going to be the death of me. Mrs. Sophie Walker, she corrected playfully. VP of Strategic Development Sophie Walker. Your wife Sophie Walker, who you're completely crazy about. All of the above, Daniel agreed, capturing her lips in a kiss that tasted like coffee and promises and forever. They were interrupted by Sophie's phone buzzing on the counter. Maya's name flashed on the screen with a text, "Stop making out with your husband and check the news. You're famous again." Sophie laughed, showing Daniel the message. Maya has radar for these things. "What's she talking about?" Daniel asked, reaching for his tablet. Sophie pulled up the business section of the Times on her phone and gasped. There on the front page of the business section was a photo of her from yesterday's conference presentation, looking confident and professional in her navy blazer, with the headline, "Rising Star, How Sophie Walker Transformed Modern Corporate Development." "Daniel," she breathed, scanning the article. "They're calling me one of the most innovative young executives in New York." "They're right," Daniel said simply, reading over her shoulder. "Listen to this. Mrs. Walker's fresh approach to strategic partnerships has increased Walker Industries' annual revenue by 30% while establishing the company as a leader in sustainable business practices." Sophie felt tears prick her eyes. 2.5 years ago, she'd been serving coffee and managing schedules. Now she was being recognized as a leader in her own right. "Hey," Daniel said softly, tilting her chin up to meet his eyes. "You earned every word of that recognition." "I know," Sophie said, and she did know. "It's just, sometimes I still can't believe this is my life." "Believe it. You're brilliant, you're successful, and you're mine." Daniel's smile was soft with pride and love. "Though I have to say, seeing you in action in those board meetings, it's incredibly attractive." "Mr. Walker, are you objectifying your wife's professional competence?" "Absolutely. Is that wrong?" "Only if you stop," Sophie replied, pulling him down for another kiss. An hour later, Sophie walked into Walker Industries, feeling like she was floating. The security guard congratulated her on the article. The elevator operator beamed at her with pride, and by the time she reached the executive floor, it felt like the entire building was buzzing with excitement. "Sophie!" Jennifer from HR practically bounced over to her desk. "Have you seen the news? Everyone's talking about it." "I saw," Sophie said with a grateful smile. "It's still surreal." "Are you kidding? You've revolutionized how we approach client relationships. The whole industry is taking notes." The morning flew by in a blur of congratulatory calls and emails. Sophie's assistant, a sharp young woman named Jessica, who reminded Sophie of herself 3 years ago, kept her supplied with coffee and managed the constant stream of interview requests from business magazines. At lunch, Maya was practically vibrating with excitement as they sat in their favorite cafe in the village. "Girl, you're on the cover of Fortune next month," Maya announced, sliding the advance copy across the table. "Look at you, looking like the boss you always were." Sophie stared at the magazine cover, herself in a power suit, standing confidently in front of the Walker Industries logo, with the caption, "New Generation Leaders, the Future is Female." "My parents are going to frame this," Sophie said, laughing at the thought of her father showing it to everyone at the post office. "They should. You're representing for all of us." Maya leaned forward conspiratorially. "So speaking of family, when are you and Daniel going to start making some little Walkers?" Sophie felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Maya, what?" "I'm asking as your best friend, who wants to be the coolest aunt in New York. Besides, you two have been married for 2 years, you're both successful and stable, and I've seen the way Daniel looks at kids in the park." "We've been talking about it," Sophie admitted. "Daniel wants to wait until I feel fully established in my role, but honestly, I think I'm ready." "Ready for what?" Maya pressed with a knowing smile. "Ready to build a family with him, ready to see what our kids would look like, what they'd be like." Sophie's voice grew soft with possibility. "Ready to give them everything our parents gave us. Love, support, the belief that they can achieve anything. And the ability to navigate both worlds," Maya added meaningfully. "Exactly. They'll grow up knowing they belong everywhere they choose to be." That evening, Sophie and Daniel sat in Carlos and Gloria Walker's elegant dining room in Boston, surrounded by family warmth and laughter. Carlos had made a full recovery and was back to his charming, slightly overwhelming self, while Gloria had embraced Sophie completely as the daughter she'd always wanted. "So, Sophie," Gloria said as they cleared the dinner plates, "I saw your article in the Times. I'm so proud of you, dear." "Thank you, Gloria. That means the world to me." "You know," Carlos chimed in with a mischievous glint in his eye, "when Daniel first brought you home, I knew you were special. But I have to admit, I never imagined you'd end up running half the company within 2 years." "I don't run half the company," Sophie protested, laughing. You run the parts that matter, Daniel said, reaching for her hand across the table. Strategy, client relations, business development, basically everything that keeps us competitive. Speaking of development, Gloria said with obvious intent, Kelly called today. Little Carlos took his first steps. Sophie and Daniel exchanged glances, both knowing exactly where this conversation was heading. That's wonderful, Sophie said diplomatically. He's such a sweet baby, Gloria continued, clearly delighted with her grandson. Of course he'd love some cousins to play with. Mom, Daniel warned, but he was smiling. What? I'm just saying I'm not getting any younger, and I have so much love to give to grandchildren. Sophie felt Daniel squeeze her hand under the table and made a decision that surprised even her. Actually, she said, her heart racing with excitement and certainty, you might not have to wait much longer. The table went completely silent. Gloria's eyes widened with hope. Carlos grinned like he'd won the lottery, and Daniel stared at Sophie with an expression of wonder and joy. Are you saying, Gloria whispered. I'm saying we've been talking about it and we think it's time to start trying, Sophie said, feeling Daniel's thumb trace circles on her hand. No promises on timing, but we want to build a family together. Gloria actually teared up, and Carlos raised his wine glass in an impromptu toast. To the future generation of walkers. Later, as they drove back to New York through the crisp autumn night, Daniel reached across the console to hold Sophie's hand. Are you sure about what you said tonight? He asked softly. Because once we tell my parents we're trying, there's no going back. They'll be asking for updates every week. Sophie laughed. I'm sure. Daniel, I've built my career. I've proven myself professionally, and now I want to build something else with you, something that's just ours. A family, Sophie confirmed. Little people who'll have your determination and hopefully my common sense. And your strength, Daniel added, and your intelligence and your ability to charm everyone they meet. They're going to be amazing, Sophie said with quiet confidence. They are, Daniel agreed, just like their mother. 6 months later, Sophie stood in the bathroom of their penthouse at 6 in the morning, staring at 2 pink lines on a pregnancy test, with tears streaming down her face. Sophie, Daniel's voice came from the bedroom, thick with sleep. Everything okay? She walked back into their bedroom, test in hand, unable to speak past the emotion in her throat. Daniel sat up immediately, instantly alert. What is it? Sophie climbed onto the bed and held out the test, watching as understanding dawned in his eyes. Really? He whispered, his voice filled with awe. Really? Sophie managed through her tears. We're having a baby. Daniel pulled her into his arms, holding her tight as they both cried and laughed and marveled at the miracle they'd created together. I love you, he whispered against her hair. I love you both. We love you too, Sophie whispered back, and in that moment, surrounded by morning light and infinite possibility, Sophie Walker knew that every struggle, every fear, every moment of doubt had led her exactly where she was meant to be. She was a successful executive, a beloved wife, and now a mother-to-be. She was proof that dreams could come true if you were brave enough to reach for them and strong enough to fight for them. Most importantly, she was happy, deeply, completely, authentically happy with the life she'd built and the love she'd found. Sometimes the greatest romance isn't just about finding love, it's about building a life so beautiful that every day feels like a gift. Sophie learned that when you stop trying to fit into someone else's world and start creating your own, magic happens, because the most powerful love story isn't about changing who you are. It's about finding someone who sees your worth and builds dreams with you that are bigger than either of you could imagine alone. What moments in this story resonated most with your own dreams of love and success? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your participation means a lot to the channel. Please share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment your thoughts. Your participation is very important to us. See you next time.